Okay, in class we talked about solving the quadratic equation by completing the square, and we said that the a value of the equation had to be 1 for this to work correctly. So here's what we do when we have an a value that's not 1. So notice here that we have the a value of this equation as 8. The first thing we have to do to turn that a value of 1 is we divide every item or every term in the equation by that a value, which will change the a value to 1. So if you divide 8 by 8, you get 1. Divide 2 by 8, and divide 1 by 8. So when I rewrite this equation, I get x squared minus 2/8 can be reduced to 1/4. So 1/4 x minus 1/8 is equal to, and 0 divided by 8 is 0. And that way I can go ahead and solve this equation. But when this happens, we wind up with fractions usually. And you know that you have been taught in class how to use your calculator to deal with fractions if you have a hard time doing it in your head. So what we'll do is we'll continue with this, and we will go through this, but you can do your fractions in your calculator if you need to. The first thing we're going to do is isolate the variables. So we set the a value to 1 by dividing all terms by a, and now we're going to isolate the variables on the left and the constant on the right. So I wind up with a new equation, x squared minus 1/4 x on the left and positive 1/8 on the right. I got that by adding 1/8 to both sides. And remember, we're going to leave some space on both sides because we're going to add a number in step 2 to both sides of that equation. And that number comes from taking the b value, which is in this case is 1/4, negative 1/4, dividing it by 2, and then squaring it. So what happens when I do that, 1/4 divided by 2, or negative 1/4 divided by 2, is negative 1/8. And then we're going to square it, which gives me 1/64. So I'm going to add 1/64 to both sides. So I get this equation now, x squared minus 1/4 x plus 1/64 is equal to 1/8 plus 1/64. Now, all I've got to do is now at this point is to, on the third step, is to factor the left and simplify the right. And when I do that, this factor on the left, when we learned about factoring perfect square trinomials, because that's what you turned this into, you get the letter, the first operation, and half that number, and half of 1/4 is 1/8. So you get x minus 1/8 in parentheses squared, and this on the right adds together. If I change the denominators both to 64, I get 8/64 here, and so I get 9/64 on the right. So the final step when you have this perfect square trinomial equation is to finally take the square root of both sides. Step 4 takes the square root of both sides, and when I take the square root of the right, let's go ahead and put the equation here. Let's put this equation here. And when I take the square root of the left and the square root of the right, I get two equations because these cancel. So I get x minus 1/8 is equal to the plus or minus of 9/64. The square root of that, which is 3/8. I get the square root of 9/64, which is the square root of 9 over the square root of 64 is 3/8. And then I've got two equations. When I solve this equation, I get x minus 1/8 is equal to positive 3/8, and x minus 1/8 is equal to negative 3/8. And when I add 1/8 to both sides, I get 4/8, or 1/2 for the first value. And then when I add 1/8 to both sides here, I get 2/8, negative 2/8, which is also equal to negative 1/4. So my two answers are x is equal to the set of numbers of negative 1/4 and 1/2. And that's how you do it. You just have to make sure you realize that when you divide through by that a value, you're going to wind up with fractions, and those fractions can be easily done. You've just got to be very careful in how to deal with fractions. If you have a hard time adding and subtracting fractions, your calculator that you use in class will do it for you. But you really should review that skill so that you can do this better mentally.